particularly around other people. And just like the surges before, we're keeping a very close watch on the hospitals. That's what would push us to more aggressive measures if we had to.
The United States Supreme Court has heard two arguments this past week on the federal mandate from the Biden administration. One is for businesses with employees of over 100 have to be vaccinated. The other is for certain healthcare workers. If the Supreme Court upholds that mandate, do you have some sort of idea of how that would impact your state?
Most of the hospitals have already moved forward with urging their staff to get vaccinated when the rule initially came out. I'll tell you, my ultimate priority here is to get people vaccinated. And one of my concerns is that the more we talk politics, the more that we get into the inside baseball of these rules and these mandates, on some degree, it distracts the conversation because we're talking about the political side and we're not talking about why it's important to get vaccinated, why it's important for an individual, why it's important to their family. I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. I don't know what's going to happen with the federal mandates, but I do know that a hospital provides safer care if their staff is vaccinated. I do know a nursing home is better set to provide care for their vulnerable residents if their staff are vaccinated. And any individual is safer and their family is safer if they get vaccinated. I think we got to keep messaging that appropriately and not try and get people bogged down in all the politics of it.
And the messaging, of course, has been
Democratic base. Americans overwhelmingly support voter IDs. Getting an ID is easy in the United States, and it's also free if you can't afford it. And so, so much of this is about mobilizing the base. And I think for most Americans, particularly independent Americans, they recognize that. So I don't. This is an issue that's not going to pass, and I think that this is just about the base.
I got to get in here, Chuck. I got to get in here, Chuck.
Go ahead.
I got to push back on my friend Sarah about how easy it is to vote in America. It is not that easy to vote in America. If you happen to look like me and you're in Georgia, you're staying in line for 6 or 7 hours to vote. It's not easy to vote in America if you happen to look like me, right? And that's been done intentionally. Republicans have intentionally shut down voting polls for places that cater to minorities and people who actually vote Democratic. And you've seen over 200 laws passed over this last year since the power of young people and black voters turn and flip states, and Hispanic voters flip states. That's not by accident, Sarah. It is harder to vote in America than it was.
The facts are, though, that it is more open in the South than it is even in the Northeast for now. And the reality is early vote, absentee vote, these have been growing for the last decade. Every year, more and more people vote by these means. And so I just don't think that's accurate.
All right. It's been growing every day. Since actually when the president gets behind something and the VP gets behind something, you can roll out and you can make change, right? It is a all hands on deck effort by the White House to move this along because they do see the urgency and as Senator Schumer talked about last week that look there's a threat to our democracy, and look, this actually sort of also buttonholes well with the conversation pivoting off of January 6th. The majority of Americans right now think that our democracy is weaker now than it's been before. You've got over 70% of Americans who thinks that January 6th was in fact an attack on our democracy. So look, this is not even about sort of just the base, although you got to animate the base around this fight. But there is a swath of middle America, Chuck, that thinks our democracy is under attack, and the president needs to politically talk to them and mobilize them as well. I think if the president and vice president are out there, barnstorming, making this a top of the list issue concern, right, I think we can get some movement on it.
Cornell, though, we don't live in a vacuum. How much does COVID sort of basically complicate? Look, the calendar's the calendar. This is an even-numbered year. I mean, it just seems unrealistic.
Well, COVID is a giant X factor. Look, I sat in focus groups. Well, I actually got to do it online now, but I've sat in my laptop looking at focus groups. And look, COVID is a big wet blanket thrown over the attitudes of Americans. They are concerned about when the next shoe's going to fall. They're concerned about whether or not we're going to go back in lockdown, or whether or not we're going to have to go back in lockdown. So there's a lot of anxiety about that. The president is doing the best he can, but you also look, a lot of this entrenchment is coming from Republicans. Both the Republicans who say over a third of Republicans say they definitely won't get the vaccination, but also look, you brought up Ron DeSantis earlier. Ron DeSantis is on the hot seat right now for allowing a stockpile of tests to just go to waste. So there is this big COVID problem. It is a wet blanket over the presidency.
Sarah Fagan, is there any penalty for Republicans being seen as not on the side of this issue?
Well, look, I think, first of all,
Fewer immigrants coming into the country looking for work and filling some of these jobs. Look at this. Over the last 6 years, net international migration into the United States, we were at 1 million in 2016. And as you know, immigration got heavily politicized, right, over this 6-year period. And look what it's dribbled down to, 247,000 through mid-year 2021. So what does this mean? Well, foreign-born workers work more often in the service industries than native-born workers. Also in natural resources and construction work. More foreign-born workers work there than native-born. We're already seeing labor shortages in the service industries in here. And you have fewer immigrants looking for these jobs. It adds to the problem. Then you can talk about the cost, right? We've heard plenty of companies say, well, rising wages mean rising costs. Well, native-born Americans do make more money. Foreign-born workers here, first-generation immigrants, first job, they make less. We can have a longer conversation about that distinction. But the fact of the matter is this: in the United States, this is what has kept our economy growing. If you will, it's been more immigrant labor. And the politicization of immigration has made members of both parties not want to deal with the fact that we're short of workers, and the biggest reason why is a lack of immigration. When we come back,
he represents, and that is a growing part of the House conference in particular, but also in the Senate. When you look at some of these other Republicans who could potentially run, they're also running in that same vein. It's not as if establishment Republicans are all of a sudden see some resurgence here.
all right, I'm going to
well,
play.
I was going to say, you know, I know. I think that many of these Republicans, though, when you think of the Ron DeSantis as the Chris Christies of the world, they're a nice bridge between President Bush and Donald Trump rhetorically. And their policies are more like a President Bush than like Donald Trump. I mean, so I don't necessarily agree with that.
All right. Well,
Is you do have to fire at the base. And look, part of and we've talked about this before, part of President Biden's problems with his job pool numbers have been, quite frankly, that they've dropped among Democrats, right? Not enough Democrats to see him as someone who's fighting and a strong leader and who's taking on these issues. I thought that his speech the other day was a very important speech where he used really important and powerful language. He will stand in that breach, right? He will not allow someone to hold a dagger to the neck of democracy. That is firing up base sort of language and laying out for Americans, quite frankly, what are the obstacles. You can either choose democracy or you can choose authoritarianism, and I think you'll see that play out even more heading into midterms.
Sarah Fagan, is there anything the January 6th committee could come up with that would turn 75% of the Republicans that support Trump right now and his misinformation down to, say, 50?
Oh, I think Adam Kinzinger said if there was some proof that the president knew what was going to happen, and he supported it and encouraged it, that perhaps could change something. But I think most people are conditioned in politics now to disbelieve what comes out of either partisan side of the aisle. So no matter what that committee puts out, because there are so few Republicans involved, and most Republicans have dismissed it, the base isn't going to believe anything that comes out of it anyway. But, look, here, we're focused on Trump, understandably so, and the aftermath of the one-year anniversary. But we're heading into, a year away from primary season. Perhaps he runs, perhaps he doesn't. Right now, 55% of Republicans would like somebody else to be the standard bearer of the Republican Party. So while he is still the dominant force, a year from now, is that 65%? He is ultimately at some point going to become a fading member of the party. Someone new will emerge.
Sarah, I've heard this from a lot of Republicans, and we want to hear of this. Maybe you're right, but Anna Palmer, it seems like Mitch McConnell's been betting on the fade for a year, and it didn't come to fruition. It felt like a moment. How did a year later we go to a Republican Party that is more in the grips of Donald Trump than what it was on January 7th, 2021?
I think we could probably spend a half hour on it. I'll give you kind of the most recent. So there's a lot of stuff that led up, but the most recent is January 7th. I'll tell you, within my Republican caucus, there was a lot of silence, a lot of discussion. Where do we go from here? This was wrong. And something happened 2 weeks later, which is Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago. And it caught everybody off guard. They were shocked. But in that picture he had with Donald Trump, and I think Kevin had told us something like, oh, I just happened to be in Florida and he wanted to meet, so I was going to meet with him. No, that was an intentional meeting. That took like these, the paddles that you see on the TV shows and resurrected Donald Trump back to life. And I think when history looks back, it'll be Kevin's meeting with Donald Trump, which actually made him as immediate of a force as it was. He may have come back, but I think that was a very important meeting.
This also really depends on what are the goals of our public health programs. Are we trying to prevent all infections and transmission? And to be clear, that's going to be exceedingly difficult even with everybody vaccinated because of the nature of this virus. This is a virus that has a very short incubation period. So unless you keep reboosting everybody every 4 to 6 months, you're not going to be able to prevent all infections. And so what we're really proposing is let's focus on what matters the most, hospitalizations and deaths. That's what we focus on for other respiratory illnesses like the flu, like RSV. How do we do a better job of preventing those hospitalizations, those deaths, particularly among the most vulnerable, so the elderly, people who are highly immunocompromised, people who are living in long-term care facilities, and of course, communities of color and others that have been highly vulnerable during this pandemic.
Zeke, you brought up the issue of mandates and how important it would be. I'm sure you have seen all the reports. At best, maybe the healthcare mandate makes it through the Supreme Court. The workplace one may not. What does that mean if the vaccine mandate is the best tool in the toolbox and you can't use it as aggressively in the federal level? Does that mean testing becomes a bigger priority?
Look, the Supreme Court has to recognize that COVID in the workplace is a real health threat and really does affect many people. And unfortunately, many frontline workers have died from COVID and contracting COVID in the workplace. They need protection, and mandating vaccination is a quite reasonable protection. I've called for 6 or 8 months now for mandates among healthcare workers. These are our best tools to get to 90% vaccinated. Testing lets us know who's infectious, but it doesn't intervene in the virus, whereas vaccines do intervene. They make sure that people who get infected don't get hospitalized at such a high rate and are very, very, very unlikely to die. That's an important protection for people, and we have to make sure that people get it. We will never get to 70, 80% or 90% of the American population vaccinated without a mandate. It's just that simple. And for the Supreme Court to take that away in the midst of an emergency seems to me to be very wrong. I signed on to an amicus brief because I think it's legal and I think it's absolutely vital for the health of the country.
Dr. Gowdy.
Everything I can to make sure that happens. And to be clear, what the Chicago Teachers Union did was an illegal walkout. They abandoned their posts and they abandoned kids and their families. We are working diligently every single day at the bargaining table to narrow the differences and to get a deal done. My team has been working every single day. They're back at it again here Sunday. They were at it yesterday. And we can get a deal done if there's goodwill on both sides. But fundamentally, what we cannot do is abandon the science. We know that the safest place for kids to be is in-person learning in schools. And we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to make our schools safe. They are safe. We've got the data to demonstrate that. We've got to get the teachers union to get real and get serious about getting back into in-person learning.
Look, I know you're making this demands. What leverage do you have? How can you force this to happen? Or are you a little bit at the whim of the teachers union?
Well, the leverage I think we have is that we've got the will of the people. Parents are outraged and they are making their outrage known to the teachers union. This is a very different dynamic than ever before. We've got an enormous amount of parent activism. They are writing letters, emails, they are protesting, they're holding press conferences. This is an unprecedented level of parent activism, all in support of returning to in-person learning. And we know why. We live in a district where 70% or more of our kids qualify for free or reduced lunch, which means they live in households that are poor and working class, which also means that they live in households with single parents, mostly women of color, who have to work to be able to keep the home together. So this
ICU of ours, which normally operates at 100% occupancy, now at about 50% of occupancy for COVID positive patients.
Dr. Shikhar Motilla advises calm for other countries now dealing with Omicron.
Had we seen high infection rates translate to high disease rates, that would have been a reason for concern. However, we have not seen a greater severity of disease with the current variant of Omicron.
In fact, the death rate in South Africa has barely risen. Dr. Angelique Coetzee is credited with first identifying the new Omicron variant.
What can the United States expect to see based on South Africa's experience?
Definitely high cases, a high number of cases, but you look at your death rate and you look at your ICU cases. So it doesn't matter how high your positivity rate is, as long as your hospitals are not overwhelmed.
The head of the CDC suggested Friday the U.S. may mimic part of South Africa's experience.
I do think in places that we are seeing this really steep incline, that we may well see also a precipitous decline, but we're also a much bigger country than South Africa.
Doctors caution that South Africa's experience is unique. It's summer there and the population is younger, but here in London, South Africa's experience is having a sequel.
Here, cases spiked from Omicron, but in the past few days have started to drop. Hospitals have been overwhelmed, but that's more because of too few staff rather than too many COVID patients. Doctors and nurses have had to call in sick after testing positive. In fact, hospitalizations in London have increased only gradually compared to last year, even as COVID cases spiked. And two key statistics that speak to the severity of the disease: the number of patients on ventilators and deaths have barely risen. There's no guarantee the U.S. follows the same path, especially since a greater percentage of the population is vaccinated in the UK. But global stats show that when it comes to Omicron, there's cause for optimism. Matt Bradley, NBC News, London.
Operating hours in some locations.
FedEx also warning customers of delays, but while large businesses are able to adapt, some small ones are barely hanging on.
If you think about the 30 million small businesses in the U.S., 90% of them have fewer than 20 employees, 80% of them have fewer than 10.
Meaning if just one person gets sick, the entire operation could be crippled.
We have the business, we don't have the staff. And so that's really frustrating. And there's new clients who want to come in that we have to turn away.
Long Beach, California's Bark Bark Daycare and Grooming forced to shut down its daycare operation, even both owners catching the virus.
We've never dealt with this situation. We feel completely helpless.
For bakers at Montclair Bread Company in New Jersey, the dough is finally rising, but so far not enough to meet costs.
If the bakery's not making the numbers, then my rent's late, which it's actually late this month. I haven't paid my January rent yet.
The bakery just reopened after COVID cases and exposure among the staff forced it to temporarily shut down.
We got a call that somebody on our staff tested positive for COVID, and then there was a second person, and then a third person.
But after sending out a call for help, over 20 volunteers like Marissa raised their hands to pitch in.
When this whole crazy bad dream of a pandemic is over, I want there to be great local stores still in existence. I was like, I can volunteer. I'll even wash dishes.
Neighborhoods coming together to try to keep their local businesses afloat.
Gotti joins us now from Los Angeles. Gotti.